Hello, everybody. This is Lars Leicht from the Somm Journal, welcoming you to our latest installment of Somm Sessions. We're here to talk to you about where Bordeaux meets the Rhone on behalf of the Somm Journal, SommFoundation, and Treasury Wine Estates. And I'll be presenting with my dear friend, Gillian Ballance. Good morning, Gillian.
Good morning. Hi, everybody.
Today, we're going to be talking to you, as we said, about where Bordeaux meets the Rhone. I always thought it was in France, but evidently it's not. We're going to find out exactly where that is. But I just want to prep everybody. There is going to be, after this, there is a quiz. And the link is going to be posted in the chat when we get to our last slide. We're going to let you know when it's posted, but you need to listen through the whole presentation because a lot of what we are telling you today is going to be on that quiz. So it'll be in the chat. We'll let you know when it's up there and available. And from that point, you will have a chance to go at it. This quiz, what's on the table is 3 $500 scholarships. So if the person who gets the most correct answers in the shortest amount of times gets a $500 scholarships, the first 3 people that do that. And your name is also thrown into the hat for a chance to attend Crush Camp out in Napa, which obviously is going to be in the fall when we're in the post-COVID era. You will have a maximum 1 try for this test. You have a 5-minute limit to take the quiz. And I hate to tell you this, but multiple results from the same IP address will be disqualified. If you've got extenuating circumstances, let us know. But if we see otherwise, we see multiple results coming in from the same IP address, we have to disqualify that. And the results will be posted on Wednesday. So what do you think, Gillian? Should we dive into this and go exploring?
Yeah. What are those grape clusters behind you?
That's a great point. Well, we're talking about where Bordeaux meets the Rhone. So obviously with Bordeaux, we're talking about Cabernet Sauvignon, and with the Rhone, we're talking about Syrah, or in the case of today's discussion, Shiraz. So you have it on the screen in front of you, but also behind me to my, I'm going to call this my right, and this is my left. And if anybody wants to jump on chat and guess which one is which, so again, my right, my left, tell us which grape is which grape is Cabernet and which grape is Shiraz, and you won't win a thing, but you'll feel good for the day. So, and you make me feel good.
They do look very different.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So hopefully we'll get some people participating in that.
Yeah, that would be fun. So let's move along to the presentation, if you would kindly do so. You're in the driver's seat, Gillian. Give me a slide. Fantastic.
There we go.
There we go. So I, like many of you here, love Wine Folly and their maps, and they're just great. So have to give them a plug there. We're talking about those 2 varieties that we just discussed in kind of 3 different worlds. As I said, Cabernet coming from Bordeaux. Everybody's familiar with these maps. Syrah coming from Rhone, becoming Shiraz in Australia. Why? We're going to talk about that a little bit more today. So what do you see? What are some of the commonalities? Well, there's a lot of blue, meaning the water, in all of these to a lesser or greater extent. So obviously there is a maritime effect or a river effect that we're going to see. But, as we all know from the wine world, our grape varieties tend to react very differently in different terroirs. So let's take a look at the next slide. And I have my cheat sheet here. I kind of always like to do things in song. You've got Bordeaux, you've got Rhone, you've got South Australia, 10,000 miles apart from each other, South Australia from France. I like to sort of sing it in song, and I promise everybody here that I will not sing. But the ditty that I think anybody who, God, if you were on the East Coast in New York, born before 1960, you may have had a chance to practice the accordion. And one of the songs in the accordion thing was La Mer. The sea that the French always sang about. Classic French song, La Mer. Sorry, I know I promised not to sing. But France has, what is France's big advantage is it's got that, especially Bordeaux, that marine coastal climate. And because of its position, it has great diurnal shift. And as anybody who has suffered the crazy love of living in Bordeaux knows, a little bit more precipitation, a little bit more rainfall there. Now, Australia, their song could be right out from the when was this hit? Was it the 70s? I got sunshine, or was that the 60s? I don't know. But Australia, God knows, has sunshine. It's got actually over 500 more hours of sunlight a year, roughly an hour and a half a day, and certainly less rainfall. It's a drier climate. So let's take that to the next, and we're going to. I'm a former journalist. I actually am a journalist now for the Somm Journal. I was a journalist as well in my formative years. So I've always got this inquisitive mind. And I considered Cabernet and Shiraz to be two of my grape varieties. So I took the chance to interview them. I didn't know if you guys knew this, that I have that close of a relationship. So I said to mon ami Cabernet, I said, why do you like Bordeaux? And he said, look, it gives me complexity, it gives me structure, and it gives me pedigree. And nobody can argue with that. Pedigree from Bordeaux is what Cabernet is all about. But Cabernet also likes to roam the world. And so I said to Cabernet, when you're out there, why is Australia one of your favorite spots? What's Australia got that Bordeaux doesn't? He says, well, mate, Oz makes me smoother, less tannic, and helps me show off more of my obvious berry flavors. And it's true. It's sort of like when you get, I'm an East Coaster. So my analogy is going to be when you get a staid New Yorker always dressed in gray sweaters and tweed jackets, and all of a sudden they move to Florida and they start wearing wild, crazy print shirts. You bring these wines to that nice warm climate in Australia and they start to be a lot more expressive. So I asked the same question of Syrah. Now, Syrah already tends to be a little bit of an overdresser, tends to be a little bit more flashier. But I said, well, so your home base, tell me about the Rhone. And especially in the north of the Rhone, which we saw on the map before, around the hill of Hermitage, the wines are predominantly Syrah, and it makes a beautiful, multi-layered, deeply colored, full of black fruit flavors, great structure, elegance, tannins, and the wines are known for their ageability. So why would you go to Syrah? Why would you go to Australia? Well, it turns out when they go to Australia, it's almost like they get a new passport. They get a new name. They get a name change that becomes Shiraz. And what's really cool about Australia is there's such a history of planting Shiraz there that it's one of the few places in the world outside of the Rhone where you have 100 to 150-year-old vines, which is I would consider one of Australia's national treasures. And of course, that climate adds to more concentrated flavors. It makes the wine a little spicier, a little bolder, and gives it a little bit of a smokier edge.
Yeah, areas that never got hit with phylloxera certainly are home to some of those great old
heritage vines, right?
Heritage vines, what treasures.
Absolutely.
Most of the clonal material that's now planted throughout Australia is from those heritage clones. And yeah, really very cool history.
Absolutely. So the geography, I've been with Australian winemakers and presenters that always say if you picture it almost like the United States turned upside down, but the advantage here is that Australia is an island continent, and you've got something. What is it? It's a little bit bigger than the population of New York City in a continent the size of the United States. So a lot of
very sparsely populated.
Absolutely. And a lot of that population tends to be toward looking at the perspective of this map, the southern side. You've got that great outback in the middle, a large swath of desert, hot, arid desert. To the north, it starts getting a little bit warmer, but where you've got the more mild climate is toward the south. And that's where the vineyards and the population tend to be on that slightly cooler coastline. Let's take a look at the climate of Australia. You can see up top it gets a little warm, but you see that green area, that green belt is pretty much, I would call that the grape belt. It's a big country, hot interior desert, but those wine regions tend to be predominantly in the south. I would love to find out. Maybe we can talk later about the impact of global warming on Australia. See if anything is changing there. I'm sure you guys have discussed it, but you also have cool winds off that ocean. Remember what we talked about, that concentration of blue in those 3 maps that we looked at, and Australia certainly has influence from the South Ocean. And it's also got something that a little bit more than the Rhone and Bordeaux, it's got some higher elevation areas, especially when we're in the area that we're talking about in South Australia. You've got the Mount Lofty ranges, mountains that go from 32 to 3,900 feet above sea level. And that adds a significant difference going up as things start to get a little bit cooler, and you mitigate that impact of the fine, strong Australian sun.
Yeah, and I think because it's such a dry continent that's always one of the biggest threats, I think, to viticulture is the lack of rainfall. Yeah. The holes that are poked in the ozone layer there mean that the water will just evaporate very quickly. It doesn't really stick. So that to me continues to be one of the threats, and which is why also a lot of the viticulture is along the ocean, so that it can benefit from those kind of maritime influences,
right?
Wetter circumstances.
Exactly. Cool things down, moisten things up.
And Lars, I always thought of Australia as being like this very hot country producing, huge kind of over extracted wines. But in fact, there's so much diversity in the climate and soil, especially down in the southern parts. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. The more I've discovered about Australia, the more I've learned just the incredible diversity that it has. I think that we all tended, especially in the US, to look at Australia as just one block, one type of wine, and it's far from that. You see this wonderful diversity, and it's a very historic wine growing area. I mean, the first vines were brought over in 1788. I know in South America and in North America, some of the vines go older than that with the missions, but there was nothing going on in Australia before the 18th century. So the first fleet brought vines with them. And really in the early 1820s, Hunter Valley became an established wine region. And by 1830, you had this incredible grape nerd named James Busby, who traveled to Europe, brought back a collection of grapes, wanting to see what would be going on. Very similar to Thomas Jefferson's approach, saying, we could grow anything here, so let's try it. He brought back 650 different varieties. Only about half of them survived the journey, but he planted them. He also, my understanding is he also had some property in New Zealand, and really was a tremendous pioneer. And I also have, we've been told that a lot of the cuttings in modern Australian viticulture today date back to these ancestor vines that Busby brought with him from the old world. So it's a really fascinating winemaking country. Like I said, with a lot more depth and a lot more layers, and really bears exploring some more. I can't wait till we get to travel there again too.
Yeah, really. And yeah, a relatively short history, but so much packed into it. Yeah. Right. I mean, look at old world regions that, yes, they do date back thousands of years, but this is a really they fast tracked it onto the global wine scene in several ways. But yeah, that's a picture of James Busby right there. And first commercial winery was established in Hunter Valley, I believe, because of the proximity to Sydney. Right, kind of like Napa's
the gateway
to San Francisco, right, where people could travel to wine country. It was a port city, was close by, so they could export wine. So yeah, a lot of cool history there, which is a great segue into talking about Penfolds, right, Lars?
Absolutely. Bring it on.
And I have to say, when I started studying wine, which was a really long time ago, there were very few geographic indications. There were maybe a few dozen that we were, most interested in. And how things have changed. We've seen that nearly double to 63 or 64. Yeah. With even some sub-regions, and the subdivision continues as Australia is flipping to this very regional centric kind of wine growing area, really kind of specializing or finding those areas that specialize in certain varietals. And I definitely think that Penfolds was at the forefront of that research and vineyard exploration and development, which is just such a cool feather in our cap. But just wanted to point that out in terms of, I don't know, just how much Australia has grown and changed over the years. This is just a quick beauty shot of our Kalimna vineyard in the Barossa Valley, as Lars was mentioning, how old vines are really one of Australia's hidden treasures.
Looking gnarly.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the more gnarled the trunk, the older the vine, right? And some of these, I've been to this vineyard, and these are 150 plus year old Cabernet vines that are still on original rootstock because phylloxera never reared its ugly head into the Barossa Valley. One, because they were very good about containing it, and two, because it's very hot and there's a lot of sandy soils. So the louse really can't latch on to anything. But some of these old gnarly trunks you can actually see through at this point. But yeah, still producing some old vine clusters of fruit for us, very precious, that go into several of the Penfolds bottlings, and that's our Kalimna vineyard in the Barossa Valley. This is another great picture, again, kind of highlighting the diversity of soil types that you can find in Australia. This is that really cool Terra Rossa soil. I'm sure a lot of people, if you've studied Australia and you've studied wine for a number of years, you've definitely seen this picture because it is truly one of the things that contributes to growing really fantastic Cabernet Sauvignon, also Syrah or Shiraz, in this Coonawarra area, the limestone coast. But you can see on that top is all like this rich red clay, and then right underneath limestone. And Australia is home to the oldest soils in the world. So hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years have given these layers of richness to the wines and the grapevines. Have you been to Coonawarra, Lars?
I have not. I've been to Sydney and I've been to Melbourne, and that was it.
It's interesting. It's really flat,
Yes.
kind of dock. But being on that limestone coast with that really nice bed of limestone soil, cooler climate for sure, really gives some unique characteristics to the Cabernet from there.
It really is fascinating. I've spoken with winemakers from there that talk about when you punch down and you get that whole layer of rock under there. It's crazy. I've also spoken to winemakers who've done caving explorations underneath it all, which is a little scary.
Yeah. And now this is from our Winds estate. We actually have a chunk dug out like this so that you can see, can't really see it in this slide, but you can see how far down the vine's roots are digging for its nutrients. The struggle of the vine, they say it adds to complexity. A little bit about the history of Penfolds, since we are featuring our fabulous Bin 389 Cabernet Sauvignon Shiraz blend today. I don't think that you can pick up a wine book and not see the Penfolds name, especially when it pertains to Australia, but just such a global force in modern winemaking and the history. And the history is really cool. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because we do want to get to our special surprise guest today and tasting the wine. But this is
you get somebody out of bed in Australia at 4:30 a.m.
Well, not quite, but we got an Australian out of bed at 10:30 a.m. in Napa Valley.
That's already a major accomplishment.
Hopefully he didn't hear that. Anyway, so that's a picture of Dr. and Mary Penfold, who were some of the first, they were the first wave of migrants really to colonize that part of South Australia. They purchased a 500-acre property right outside of Adelaide in 1844. And the city of Adelaide was only officially founded in 1836. So to call them pioneers is an understatement. They bought this estate for £1,200.
Wow.
built a cottage, planted vineyards. The cottage is called the Grange, and it's named after Mary Penfold's homestead in the UK. So hence the name of our most iconic wine, Grange. But that all started in 1844. They were then, asking a lot of doctors to come over and colonize these parts of Australia, and in fact would obviously sell them land at a pretty reasonable price. Dr. Penfold's quickly established a medical practice, all based on growing grapes and creating tonics that he would prescribe as medication, fortified wines essentially. So the business grew substantially.
My favorite kind of doctor, by the way.
Right, everyone's favorite. And when you go and you visit the McGill estate, you can walk into the Grange cottage. You can walk into his office and see his prescription pad and see the little vials of things that he would prescribe for insomnia, for dysentery, for all those things that we drink alcohol for today. So,
that's my story, and I'm sticking with it.
Yeah, and as far as we understand, Dr. Penfold was really driving the medical business. We have old pictures of him on horse and buggy delivering medication. And Mary really took care of the homestead, which meant taking care of the vines and the vineyards. And in fact, when Dr. Penfold passed away, she took over winery operations. But by that time, they had really grown into something pretty big. This is a picture of the original cellars being excavated in 1890 at the original McGill estate, which was right outside of the town of Adelaide. So when you talk about rich history, man, Penfold's is layered with it. And I do feel like it's that history that's driven the innovation and tradition and greatness that exists in the wines today. This is the Bluestone Winery. So that was built in 1901. Again, this is, kind of Mary at the helm, really starting to drive and build on the successes that they achieved in the late 1800s. This is the McGill estate today, equipped with a beautiful Michelin-starred restaurant, the original winery, which is still used to make the wines. We also have another facility in the Barossa Valley in Noreuta, but this is really the heart of the birthplace of Penfolds, if you will. Now, this used to be, as I said, 500 acres. It has since shrunk down to about 14, which go into a McGill estate bottling of Shiraz and also Grange. And that just happened because the city was growing. So there was this urban sprawl happening that really forced them to kind of shrink their vineyard land. But that also forced Penfolds into this kind of modern era of seeking out and developing other vineyard sites.
Max.
Yeah, there's Max. So far and above one of the most famous figures in the wine industry for so many reasons, and started at Penfolds when he was just a teenager. He was, I think, 14 or 15 years old, was a messenger boy. He went off to serve his country in World War II and came back and was given a job again and made chief winemaker in 1948 and was the chief winemaker from 1948 to 1975. And this was the first time that they had one dedicated winemaker who would oversee all the operations in the history of the family's business. So Max was very pivotal in kind of, in my mind, bringing Penfolds into the modern age. And one of those significant wines that did that was the Grange wine. So up until that point, Penfolds was still producing a lot of fortified wines, the sweet, sticky stuff. And Max
a lot of Australians were, right?
Yeah, but times were changing. It's like when we used to drink big, huge, buttery over oak Chardonnay here in California. Now we're like drinking these, neutral oaked, lighter, picked earlier versions. But yeah, soldiers went away to fight and were intrigued by the European wines, by the quality.
Yeah.
Max went over to Bordeaux and the Rhone Valley and to Portugal, and he said he never tasted anything like these great wines of Bordeaux, and why couldn't he come back to Australia and do the same thing? So that's kind of what he set out to do. And really the rest is history. But if you think about Max, Don Ditter or John Duval, the contributions that Ray Beckwith made when he was working with Max on microbial spoilage, on malolactic fermentations, like really changed the world, changed the face of the wine world for Australia, no doubt.
And arguably a lot of the rest of the wine world too, not just Australia.
Yeah. Okay, so here we are at bin 389. So this was first produced in 1960. So just 9 years after the first vintage of Grange, often referred to as baby Grange because it's essentially deselected fruit that would have gone into Grange or would have gone into 707 Cabernet. So it's kind of those deselections. It's also put into the same barrels that are used for Grange in prior years. So referred to as bin 389. Do you have yours handy, Lars?
I just so happen to, yes, absolutely.
Okay, and hopefully several of our participants are also here to taste along with us. And we have somebody here, Penfold's greatest ambassador in the United States, Mr. Tim Irwin, who in fact studied winemaking and has been working with the Penfolds brand for several years. Tim, are you there?
I'm here, Gillian. How are you? Hello, Lars. I heard you're having a Penfolds party, so I decided to crash.
We are. It's a little early, but we do our best.
It's never too early.
And of course, our dear friend from Somm Journal, Lars, is on with us today as well to guide us through. He gave a great intro to Australia, to the regions. I did a little bit of history of Penfolds, but we want you to be kind of the guy who ties it all together for us in tasting this incredible wine. Maybe you could give us a little bit of background on why the blend of Cabernet Sauvignon and Shiraz. And
yeah,
whoever's out there and wants to start tasting, highly encourage that.
Yeah, I'd love to. Hello, Lars. Good to always be with you, albeit virtually. But, it's, when you think about the blend of Cabernet and Shiraz, and I'm sure we touched on a little bit about the history of Australia. I mean, these were synonymous with what we did originally back in 1844. So in terms of having that claret style and Burgundian style coming together, in terms of those varietals, that's really what we're making with our fortified wines originally. So, lots of old plantings of Grenache, Syrah, Mourvedre, all of these classic varietals, and then those Bordeaux varietals like Cabernet that we love so much. So this was very common. And then just after the war, I heard you mention Max went to war. He had a real feeling that table wines would become more of the fruition around what people were drinking. So, today it's quite common and almost very Australian to blend these two varietals together. But when you think about what they add to the wine, with a wine like bin 389, if we use it as an example, they're looking for a freshness, a generosity, a very buoyant wine, if you will. So you're getting things like the perfume, the intensity from the Cabernet and those lovely kind of chocolatey tannins that we like. And, originally it was the warmer climates, now some of the cooler climates. And then the Shiraz brings this lovely opulence and fleshiness and then that generosity of fruit. So, when you blend these two together, it's altogether something different that you may see something in the old world with these wines. And obviously, it's quite uncommon, but in Australia, this is very prominent.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I have always loved about Penfolds wines is that nod to the old world, kind of reserved slight savoriness to the wines. And this definitely has, some of that black olive, the mocha, really lots and lots of layers of aromatics, just really profound. And I love this 2018 vintage. It's really kind of going down in the books for me as one of my favorites. Not that every bin 389 is not always great, but this just has this, like you said, that real generosity to it without being, jammy or over the top or too high in alcohol, really beautifully balanced. Now, I know that there are some pretty unique winemaking techniques that are utilized at Penfolds. If you could describe a couple of those and what they contribute to this bin 389, that would be great.
Yeah, I'd love to. And, you know, you mentioned the old world, Gillian, and, you know, Max in the late 1940s was sent to, you know, Portugal and Spain for sherry and port, but he actually went to Bordeaux. And there in Bordeaux, he started to learn some of these new techniques that he wasn't as familiar with, things like, you know, barrel maturation, things like that to finish the ferment. So when we think about kind of some of the learnings and kind of going back to the motherland, if you will, like Bordeaux, as an example, a lot of these techniques are instilled in these wines. So, you know, you mentioned things that are unique. We use things called header boards or wax header boards. And basically during the fermentation, as you know, the berries and everything's kind of arising, it's about huge extraction, if you will. And when I say huge extraction, about getting as much as you can out of the fruit as possible. So during that fermentation, these header boards will actually submerge the cap and hold it down. And that is about getting as much out of the skins and as many tannins as possible. And then it goes into a rack and return process, so almost like coming back over through again to extract as much as we can from the fruit to get that lovely intensity. You mentioned balance. And I think that's an important part of it as well. And that then a portion of the fruit will actually see barrel maturation as well. So finishing it off in oak. And Max always said it's about as much of getting the wine into the oak as the oak into the wine and finding that balance. And, you know, a lot of these of these traditions still exist today. And it's about maintaining this consistency in terms of production methods. And then over time, there's little things that have happened, slight tweaks, if you will. So, you know, using kind of stainless steel and temperature controlled processes as well during this process will also allow for that purity of fruit to come through as well. So the traditions stay all the way through that Max created, but then there's slight tweaks along the way as we see these innovations come. And all it is about complementing, but keeping that house style and consistency true to its form.
Yeah, and Max really was credited with kind of this whole transition into still wine production back then, and really interesting to see that some of those techniques are still incorporated, or a lot of the techniques are still incorporated into the Penfolds wines. And you know, I've heard Steph Dutton say that she feels like this wine can't be imitated. It's just a style that's unique to its own self, and been produced since 1960. So aside from winemaking techniques and the oak regimen, what other things to you really make bin 389 so special?
Yeah, I think, you know, the fruit is always, you know, absolutely critical. You know, the vineyards we have and the sourcing is so important. And, you know, as you think about the winemakers, when they're constantly walking the rows of these vineyards, really old materials, you know, some of the oldest Cabernet vines in the world back to the 1880s. And, you know, so that's really, you know, when we think about bin 389, the fruit is such a critical component to making it what it is. Yes, it is, I think, very stylistically unique compared to some, but I think it really emphasizes the house style of Penfolds. Like if you ask anyone, we have Grange, and it is baby Grange, as you mentioned, Gillian, earlier, from old oak used here. So the old American oak is then used on baby Grange. But I think the fruit, the sourcing, the techniques, it is so unique in the wine world and offers something completely different. And that was the intent, right? It's all about, you know, when you speak to people like Steph or Peter Gago, our chief winemaker, it's all about offering something unique and different to the wine world, which is why we all love it so much. So all of these put together, I think, create something, you know, very different. And I think the thing I love about bin 389, it's a personal favorite of mine, is it drinks and is so approachable now. Like you're drinking, and Lars is drinking, so many people out there, but will age. That's the beautiful thing about this, is it will age 10, 20, 30, 40 years with great vintages. So that to me is really exciting if you love to see those tertiary characters come into a wine as well.
Hey, Tim,
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Gillian.
Go ahead, Lars.
Can I jump in with just a fast question, because you mentioned the aging of the wines? How does the wine evolve? Does the Shiraz sort of start to dominate a little bit more on the nose or anything like that, or the Cab? As the wine ages, do they shapeshift a little bit with their role playing?
Yeah, I mean, over time, I think you naturally see this kind of transition of the wine, you know, after 5 years, 10 years, it really evolves, right? And I think that's something unique to Penfolds as well. Like if you asked Peter Gago, for example, if he was here, he said, "Hey, Peter, how does this wine look?" He said, "You know, come back in 20 or 30 years and I'll tell you how good it is," right? In terms of, you know, very humbled by a lot of the accolades we get. But to your question, Lars, in terms of the evolution, it's about 50-50 typically, the blend, right? So I think the Cabernet, you're getting a lot of that structure come through. You sometimes see some of those kind of pure characters of some of these varietals come through, but what you really see is those tertiary notes across the board, right? And so you start to see those leather, kind of cigar box, some of these flavors really evolve, and it's just a different complexity, right? Because some people like their wines differently. I personally love aged wine, as a lot of people do. So I think it's that complexity you get that's so unique, and I think both varietals will play a role depending where it is in its kind of life stage and how old it is. So it's a good question, Lars. Maybe we need to open up some old bottles with everybody next, and then we can really dig into it and have a bit of fun.
I'd be thrilled to.
Yeah, we need to do that. We have another question, Tim. Where are the American oak barrels from, and do we use multiple cooperages and toast levels?
Yeah, so we use a lot of the AP John cooperages in Australia as the supplier. You know, a lot of our American oak comes from, you know, the Great Lakes here in America as well. So Quercus alba is the type of oak that we use here. So, you know, we use a lot of oak across the board at Penfolds, but in particular for Bin 389, that is a huge component. So supporting the US economy, and we love American oak. So it is great. So yeah, a lot from the.
Well, there's always been great relationships, right, with winemakers, the wine industry between the United States and Australia. I think Treasury is a perfect example of that. And American oak, historically a lot less expensive than French, for sure.
Yeah. Yep. And you've got to remember, when Max started Grange and then Bin 389 just a few years later, he didn't have access to a lot of new oak and things like that, and that's why you've seen it kind of change over time. And so, you know, he always said, especially when I was hiding those Granges, 57, 58, and 59, he says, it's actually easier to hide barrels than it is invoices. So he was using what he had, and he had a lot of American oak, fortunately, on hand. So
how many vintages of Grange did he hide?
It was 3, actually, 57, 58, and 59. And when everyone comes down to Adelaide, you can actually see where he used to hide it. So nice. Defiant and courageous and innovative and all those good things that we love, but obviously a pioneer and you know, kind of crafted the DNA for Penfolds across the board. So
were they ever released, those vintages?
They were released eventually. It's quite an interesting story. 51 was the first experimental vintage after he came back from Bordeaux. And then it was very misunderstood, this wine, you know, tannic structure and all the, you know, something that, you know, is quite common today. And the family actually said, you've got to stop making this wine, Max, after a couple of vintages. And it was Jeffrey Penfold Highland, who was part of the family's in Sydney. And he said to Max, you've got to keep making these wines. So obviously he made it in secrecy. But they did eventually see the light of day, in the 1955 Grange won a lot of accolades and kind of redefined what Max had in his mind in terms of table wine and consumption. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I've seen recordings with Max also talking about, you know, for so many years they were making fortified wines, and the fruit they were using for that was great. So when they had to, when they transitioned into the still red wines, that's really when sourcing exploded. Right? They started to plant more Cabernet Sauvignon in very specific areas and really started that kind of vineyard development, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of came to the forefront. Like, luckily they had some sourcing originally, but as table wines and styles and regions came to life, that was really important. And what Max was trying to do with, you know, if we think about Bordeaux, is the climate in Australia is very different to Bordeaux. So he had to adjust the style of the wines and what he'd learnt in France to the local region. So with that came a lot of innovation and experimentation, and not just Grange, but a wine, Saint-Henri, which was originally predominantly Cabernet and Mourvedre or Mataro, as we call it. Definitely became more Shiraz through these experimental kind of wines. As we think about Cabernet and Shiraz as well, that evolution kind of evolved and created these house styles like Bin 389 as well.
We have one more question about the assessment for aging with the 2018 vintage.
Yeah. So in terms of aging, it's directional, right? I would say, you know, that basically, to take a step back, the winemakers are going through a process called classification. And during classification, they're getting the wines, they're actually tasting it blind. They don't know where they come from. And they're grading the fruit per style, starting with Grange and then all the way through the whole portfolio. So, you know, Bin 389, whatever doesn't make the cut for Grange, then goes into Bin 389, which hence the name, baby Grange, old oak, things like that. And during that process, they're obviously assessing the wines. There's two things that we do that in terms of ageability come to life. So of course, there's the structure of the wine, the fruit, the tannins, everything's coming together in that space. But it's a continual assessment in terms of that ageable component. Two things that we do that you may have heard of. One is recorking clinics, where we're constantly assessing collectors' wines in terms of how they're aging, how they've stored them. That's a complimentary service that we do. Any Penfolds red wine 15 years or older, we pop them up all over the world. So if you have a cellar or, you know, a restaurant or what have you, we'll assess those bottles for you. So ping us a note so we can come to your city. The second thing we do, and I actually have a copy here, I feel like I carry this is like the Penfolds form guide, is the rewards of patience. So yes, Gillian has it as well. Lars, I hope you've got yours.
Oh, Lord.
But, yeah, we'll make
I will
sure you
tomorrow.
Yeah, yes, exactly. The 8th edition is about to launch. And basically this book is an assessment every 5 years of the entire range of Penfolds wine. So this is your drinking window. So this is constantly updating it, because the ultimate question we all have is, when should we be drinking these wines? Well, this takes some of that guesswork out. So it's Andrew Kayard, who's a master of wine, with a complete independent panel that assesses the whole museum and portfolio of wine. So 2018, we're looking at, you know, 2030 beyond, but we'll keep assessing that as we go through. So in terms of the vintage, Gillian mentioned it, it's a really strong vintage. There's consistency and we're excited by it, but, you know, depending how you like your wines, rest assured you can put those down 2030, 2035, and we'll continue to assess that.
I would volunteer to be on that panel, by the way.
Yeah, really. They've been doing that
I'll write it down
for a number of years, right?
The rewards of patient, or just classification in
classification
general?
Of the wines every year. I mean, that's just like standard.
Yeah, that's standard kind of practice, I guess, in terms of getting that consistency of style. So, you know, Bin 389 originally started, like all our wines, as, you know, some sourcing from some vineyards, but over time, some of that sourcing may change. And so with that vintage variation year in and year out, they're trying to get that consistency. So that's where that regional sourcing, this is now a multi-regionally blended wine, and we're constantly finding pockets. So for example, sometimes there might be a bit more Cabernet, or sometimes there might be a bit more Shiraz, and that's that consistency of style. And that's where classification is so key. And, you know, you get people like John Bird, who worked with Max Schubert, and he's been with the winery for 60 consecutive vintages, that will come into classification as well. So there is a DNA, there is a legacy and a loyalty with a lot of these winemakers. You know, Steve Leonard celebrating 35 vintages. Steve Leonard just retired after 40 vintages. Andrew Baldwin has just spent 35 vintages. Peter's often referred to as a little bit younger because he's only been there for 30 years. So it's pretty amazing, the legacy. Yeah. So classification is very much at the heart of what we do in terms of that process.
So Peter Gago is the 4th chief winemaker in the history.
Correct.
And was appointed chief winemaker in 2002, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, he actually joined the winemaking team in 1988 to resurrect the sparkling program way back when. Obviously, a sparkling and champagne aficionado and a loyalist to it all. Now we have champagne wines as well. But yeah, 2002. So only ever 4 winemakers for Penfolds Grange. And yeah, it's they often joke there's 3 important jobs in Australia. One is the Australian Prime Minister. Second one is the Australian cricket captain, and third is the Penfolds winemaker. And based on performance, I'd say he's pretty close to the top of the list there.
Like that.
Fantastic. We have another question about the Langdon classification and its influence on the winemaking style. Does it influence the winemaking style at Penfolds?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it necessarily influences the style. I would say you know, wines like this, there's this time-honored tradition that we now, once a wine is cemented in a style, we're really honoring that. And I think that's loyal to both our collectors and consumers. And then what we do is for future generations. So, you know, we respect Langton's in terms of a classification and what they do. And, you know, Bin 389 is the most collected red wine in Australia. You know, and they're publications that we see there as well. So I wouldn't necessarily, it influences the style of what we do, but we definitely respect them in terms of what they offer and in terms of, you know, the secondary market as well, that we touched on before.
I do recall, you know, in the 90s when I was, you know, buying a lot of Australian wines, that so many were pushing that ripeness level to get kind of the showy big points. And I've always been so appreciative that Penfolds kind of has always stuck to their, like you said, the house style wines that achieve good balance and are not, you know, these real over the top expressions, which, you know, if you pop the cork on a few years later, you find that everything's dropped out, right?
Yeah.
The corsets come off and there's no
Almost made me spit my wine out with that one.
Sorry.
Yeah. It is important, Gillian, and I think, you know, we see wines like RWT, the Barossa Valley Shiraz, emerge, and basically that emerged because everyone said, well, why don't you make Grange in French oak? We're not going to make Grange in French oak. It's Grange. It's always been American oak. So that's where you see new wines emerge. Wines like Yatana, our flagship Chardonnay, it took 144 trials. It's been 144 for that very reason. So in terms of evolution and style and things like that, you know, we might come out with a new wine that's complementary. It takes a very long time to kind of instill a new wine within the portfolio, I would say. But that being said, you know, with wines that exist, we want to pay respect to those styles and what they bring to the table.
Amazing. Tim, you live and breathe Penfolds. I'm just like in awe of your passion for these wines. And I know that you have to kind of bring this back into the forefront of the American sommeliers and buyers who, again, you know, kind of like Lars was saying, think of Australian wine and they lump it into one group. And these wines are just so unique, and you really can't argue the history, the winemaking, the vineyard sourcing for, you know, since 1844. These wines are pretty hard to imitate. But what are you excited about for Penfolds, just future, in the future, moving forward? Like what really, I know your kids wake you up every day at 4 in the morning, but what?
Perfect time for a glass of Bin 389. No, look, there's so much to be excited about. I think first and foremost, you touched on it, Gillian. You know, this is 177 years this year. So we look at it as all as custodians to the winery and what it represents. So there is that cultural reference that we love. And, you know, I love getting up every day, whether it be 4:30 or what have you, to talk about Penfolds. But I appreciate everyone's support out there, you know, sharing a good glass of wine. You know, we've got some exciting things on the horizon. I will say, you know, we've had a 30-year project in California with Penfolds that started with some cuttings from our McGillen Kalimna vineyard that we grafted on over here many years ago. So that's going to be coming to the forefront very, very soon. And you might see a couple of these varietals in one of the wines too. So it's been a long journey. So I'd say, you know, it's 2021. It's a new year. There's a lot of optimism, and keep an eye out for Penfolds California. And I can't wait to share these wines with everybody and you know, have a good glass.
We can't wait either. Thank you so much for being a part of our Somm session. You know, there's scholarship money available to viewers today. Many are enjoying the Bin 389, so it's a good day here for Treasury, Somm Journal, SommFoundation, and of course Penfolds and our fantastic Tim Irwin. But Lars, I'm gonna put you on the spot really quick.
Boy.
Because we have not even addressed food. And
Ooh.
every sommelier loves to hear about some good pairing options. What would you, if this bottle makes it to your dinner table tonight, which judging by how many times you've lifted up your glass, I'm going to say it probably won't. But if it did,
Exactly.
what would you be enjoying with this fantastic bin 389?
Well, so you're calling it baby Grange. So I think of what I would have Grange with, and then I don't even know if I take it down a notch, because I think you could have the same pairings. Obviously, the natural ones are any roast, any game, but I would say this would also go very nicely with something with a rich, a gravied meat to it, a nice pot roast, anything along those lines, an aged cheese. You've got that structure and definition from the Cabernet. You've got the richness and depth from Syrah. So I wouldn't limit it just to a meditative wine. There's so much more you can do with it. It becomes something greater than the sum of its parts. So, you can run the gamut with this wine, even for what wouldn't necessarily be big wine dishes, so to speak, because it's that iron fist and a velvet glove. You've got a lot of nice. The wine doesn't knock you over. It doesn't overwhelm you. But obviously, as you could see from my experience, it does definitely keep calling you for another glass. It's got good acidity and good balance, makes it a wonderful food wine. So you could go all over the board with this. You could even, you could have this with a lowly roast chicken, I would say, right up to any sort of game. Tremendous amount of versatility for this wine.
Yeah. Yeah. Or even, some sorts of like ethnic cuisines, like Moroccan food.
Yeah.
A tagine or something like that.
It could handle some spice because of the roundness.
Yeah. What a fantastic.
Gillian, I can see Alexandra in the chat talking up fatty fishes too. So there is a lot of versatility. I like that. And Ivan's already seconded that one. So it's that's a good call right there. I'll definitely
very cool.
Yeah, fish with any sort of Mediterranean flavors. You get some tomatoes and herbs in there with a nice meaty
black
fish.
Olives.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, great. So many things that I could think of to enjoy with this wine.
Oh, who said alla puttanesca?
It's just me and the Rutherford House and, and the wine itself. So, well, listen, this has been such a fantastic session. Lars, I really appreciate all of the intro that you did to Australia, why Cabernet Sauvignon and Shiraz together. I think we kind of put that message out there, gave you a little bit of history of Penfolds and how, what a dynamic wine company to survive the 176 years and to continue to innovate and continue to produce wines that the world just thirsts for. And as you can see, hopefully, those of you that tasted this wine today, there's so much freshness. There's layers and layers of aromatics. There's really nice, juicy kind of mid palate to the wine. Very, very long finish, very, very high quality. And what a treat for today. We're going to go over a little bit of some of the details on how you can get $500 scholarships today by answering and joining in on our quiz. So,
but first,
yes,
I owe everybody an answer about
these two grapes.
Oh yeah, you do.
Which is which? So I'm just going to point because I'm confused now myself about which is my right and stage right and everything else. So this one is Syrah Shiraz. And this is Cabernet Sauvignon. There you have it. Congratulations to those who got it right. You get to feel good today. That's your prize. However, we do have some great opportunities for prizes, which Gillian, if you give us the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about what's going on in a very short while. The quiz is going to be posted.
Mm-hmm. Well, my computer does not want to advance, but I think you've got it all committed to memory. So
absolutely. So again, we'll go on. We're going to go over. You have everybody here. The audience has a checklist of what you have to do today. Gillian and I finished our checklist, but your checklist, first item on it is going to be to take the quiz. Go to the link that is going to be posted momentarily, correctly, on the chat box. You have a maximum of, once you start, you have a maximum of 5 minutes to complete that quiz. You get one attempt only. The most correct answers in the shortest amount of time wins. There are 3 winners. They each get $500 scholarship, which is always appreciated, even more so these days. The quiz must be completed by 1 p.m. Pacific time today. You will also have a chance to be your name thrown into the hat for Crush Camp in the fall in Napa. So great opportunity there. You also have 1 year access to the global diagram of wine, which maybe Gillian can speak about that a little bit more. But the other thing on your list, the second thing to do on your list, is to register for the next Somm session. The topic is going to be, it's all about the dust. And if you haven't guessed already what area we're talking about, you almost shouldn't be allowed on. But obviously, we're talking about Beaulieu Vineyard, the George de la Tour Private Reserve, Cabernet Sauvignon, and the famous Andrei Chelychev's line about Rutherford, it's all about the dust. So that's going to be on February 8th at 11 a.m. Pacific. And that registration link will be put up. We'll put up another fun tease. And as you know, there's also going to be an opportunity for the first, how many people is it that are able to, the first,
50.
how many registrants get a 50?
50.
Yeah, 50. That's great. That will be able to get a bottle of wine to taste along with us, courtesy of Treasury Wine Estates. Everybody else has to dig into their cellar, which isn't too big of a sacrifice as we saw today. So Gillian, I want to thank you. I want to thank Tim. Obviously, we want to thank the Somm Journal, all of Treasury Wine Estates, and the SommFoundation. The quiz has the link been posted there on the chat?
Yes, it will be posted as soon as we wrap up.
Great.
And it will stay live for a while. So we're not going to end the Zoom call. We'll keep the link available in the chat box so that people have time to cut and paste it, or or you can click actually directly onto that link that's in the chat box, which is great.
Even better. And remember, we one IP address. One IP address. Unless you've got extenuating circumstances that you want to let us know about. Otherwise, we try to keep it clean that way and keep it fair for everybody.
Yep.
So,
well, I just thank you again, Lars. I can't say enough great things about how much we value our partnership with Somm Journal and all of the great things that you have been doing to pivot into the virtual world. And we're so thrilled that you select us to be a partner to get our message out there, to stay engaged with the sommelier community. Thank you, SommFoundation, as well, for bringing the scholarship to life and giving us the platform that we need to do that, because we do want our sommeliers to stay engaged and we want to stay in touch with you all as well. So thank you all of the participants today. Thrilled to have you on, and hopefully you got some good information, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one, February 8th.
Absolutely. Again, and thank everybody for taking the time to tune on today, because it's not like it was when we started doing a lot of these webinars back in March. Everybody was home. There was not much else to do. Now we know there's a lot of other webinars out there. But again, thanks to the great things that SommFoundation is doing, as well as Treasury and Somm Journal, we hope that we're able to give you some really good, valuable content. You have, what do some of the airlines say? We know you have many other choices, but we're very glad you're with us.
Absolutely. Well said, Lars. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your January, and we look forward to seeing you in February.